Hello everyone. The topic I chose to write on my final paper is solitary confinement. The video will be focusing on explaining what solitary confinement is and the negative aspect of it. The video will also explain how we can reform and improve the solitary confinement policy. Storer stated on page 86 of the textbook, solitary confinement in a dark dungeon-like cell was popular too, and inmates were often given little sustenance, such as water and bread, and only a bucket of waste. Solitary confinement was created and used in the 19th century, but as years passed, the concept of solitary confinement remained the same, but the environment has changed. According to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, the definition of solitary confinement is the state of being kept alone in a prison cell away from other prisoners. In simple terms, solitary confinement is a form of punishment for inmates. Placing inmates in solitary confinement means they are placed in a cell with a bed, toilet, and sink away from any kind of social interaction. As you can see in the next slide, this chart was created by the Marshall Project. According to their website, the Marshall Project is a nonpartisan, nonprofit news organization that seeks to create and sustain a sense of national urgency about the U.S. criminal justice system. The Marshall Project focuses on informing the public on anything relating to the criminal justice system. In the article, they had shown a chart, and this chart, as you could see now, represents data that shows the percentage of the inmates who were kept in isolation at least 22 hours a day for 15 days or more. You can see that many states still currently use solitary confinement. As you can see in the next slide, that chart was created by the Wall Street Journal news outlet. The Wall Street Journal reported that the number of inmates being placed in solitary confinement is increasing. The chart shows that 34% of the inmates are placed in solitary confinement for less than 90 days. But the chart also shows that the inmates are being placed in solitary confinement for a long period of time. Braven, a writer for the Wall Street Journal, stated that holding as many as 100,000 inmates in solitary confinement or isolated housing poses a grave problem for the criminal justice system. This contributes to the overcrowding of correctional facilities because of the way solitary confinement is being utilized. Solitary confinement is designed to only house one inmate per cell. This is the only way to place them away from inmates, correctional officers, and staff. If most prisoners are being placed in solitary confinement, sooner or later the prison facility would run out of space, which can lead to overcrowding. For the next part, I will play a small little video that shows how inmates feel when they are placed in solitary confinement.
You had people in here that's been in solitary confinement longer than I've been alive.
If you could put every emotion of the human spirit of hopelessness, pain, agony, hatred, frustration, a sense of continuous silently screaming, all these emotions, while you're locked in this cage treated like some animal. Most people wouldn't even treat an animal like that. An animal who was suffering pain, they would take him to the vet and do something for him.
Like, I had to take a lot of deep breaths before I came in here. Just being around people, it's not awkward, it's a good feeling, but it's still an anxiety feeling because I haven't been, it's like, wow, I'm around free people, I'm around regular people.
This is a behavior modification, psychological, low-intensity warfare against the mind of a human being. That's what exists here at Pelican Bay.
As you can see from the video, inmates view being placed in solitary confinement as a psychological warfare. Their minds start to change due to being isolated for a long period of time. So for this next slide, we will discuss the negative effects of placing inmates in solitary confinement. Research states that solitary confinement has a higher chance in causing the following to inmates. The first up is impaired thinking. They cannot think normally or rationally. Second would be childish emotional response. They would resort to a defense mechanism that causes them to act out in a childish way. Visual perception becomes disturbed. They would get hallucinations. This is when an inmate has an experience that they perceive as real, but in reality it is not. They also tend to have a higher suicide rate. Depression, anxiety, uncontrollable anger. Solitary confinement can also negatively affect the biological systems of the person. This means that they have a higher possibility of accelerating the development of certain diseases, and cognitive functions will decline significantly. Research shows that solitary confinement does negatively affect a person's cognitive function. So for the next slide, we will discuss a research article written by Drogan. He states that if someone is isolated and deprived of stimulation for a certain period of time, meaning that they lack interactions and opportunities for rehabilitation or education, it can cause brain functions to change in order to keep the brain stimulated. In a different research article written by Haney, he states that he compares the reaction from those in solitary confinement is similar to those who have PTSD. It affects inmates' stress levels and can cause them to not function normally. Ehalt mentions a few recommendations in reforming solitary confinement policy. The first recommendation he has is to eliminate all solitary confinement not related to violent misconduct. This means those who pose a danger or threat to others or themselves will be placed in solitary confinement as a preventative measure. Those who are non-violent should be addressed through other means rather than just putting them in solitary confinement. Limit time of isolation is another recommendation. This is to achieve legitimate and immediate correctional goals. This means that you can only place inmates in solitary confinement to achieve certain goals. For example, if an inmate got into a fight, they are placed in solitary confinement to calm down the inmate, and after a couple of hours, the inmates could be released if he is not considered dangerous. Another recommendation Ehalt has is to prohibit the use of solitary confinement, especially with the vulnerable population. Vulnerable population would be juveniles, the mentally ill, and the elderly. These populations are affected the most by solitary confinement because of their mental state. Another recommendation would be to require regular review of individuals placed in solitary confinement. We will go into this further in the upcoming slides. Another recommendation is to provide specialized transitional services to prisoners who are being prepared for transfer out of solitary confinement and into mainline prison housing, as well as those who are being released back into the communities. The last recommendation he had would be to partner with experts and researchers to advance knowledge of the cost and consequences of solitary confinement. Ehalt believes that more research is necessary to truly see the effects of solitary confinement. So for the next slide, we are going to talk about the healthcare in the prison system. The Human Rights Watch posted an article written by Fellner stating that mental health services in segregation units are typically limited to psychotropic medication. A healthcare clinician stopping at the cell front to ask how the prisoner is doing, meaning their mental health rounds, and occasional meetings in private with a clinician. Individual therapy, group therapy, structured educational, recreational, or life skill enhancing activities and other therapeutic interventions are usually not available because of insufficient resources and rules requiring prisoners to remain in their cells. Fellner states that healthcare in prisons are not advanced. Healthcare in prison is basically where a clinician stops and asks an inmate, how are they doing? That is it. There's no therapy or interventions due to the limited resources they have. One way to reform the solitary confinement policy is to focus on healthcare. Healthcare should provide prisoners with appropriate mental health treatment and care. Correctional health care professionals usually struggle in helping inmates due to policy, limited resources, and large caseloads. To address this issue, there should be a reallocation of certain funds and resources from the correctional facilities budget. Correctional healthcare programs must be revised or a new program must take its place. If the current healthcare system in prison is revised and reformed, there will be less of a need to put inmates in solitary confinement since they have the tools and resources to place them in either a psychological or medical ward for further treatment. Even if healthcare is reformed, solitary confinement will still be used. So when inmates are placed in solitary confinement, there should be a team that evaluates the inmate. The team has the discretion to evaluate if they are qualified to be placed in solitary confinement and how long they can stay in solitary confinement. The team should consist of correctional, mental, and medical health staff. Each member has a specific function. The correction staff should be a correction officer supervisor. The supervisor would deal with safety issues. Someone with a license to be a psychiatrist would also be able to focus on the inmate's mental health. Lastly, someone with a medical license can evaluate if the inmate requires any medical treatment before being placed in solitary confinement. This team will be able to professionally and safely evaluate inmates medically and psychologically. The team also has the authority and the ability to decide if the inmate is allowed back into general population or be transferred to the medical or psychological ward for further evaluation. Another reform we should focus on with regards to solitary confinement would be limiting the time of isolation. Research article shows that prolonged exposure of solitary confinement can lead to serious mental illness and mental issues among prisoners. Research says that placing an inmate in solitary confinement for more than 10 days has negative consequences. Time of isolation should range from a couple of hours to around 3 days. The maximum is 3 days because this allows the team enough time to observe and determine if it is still necessary to continue solitary confinement punishment or not. In conclusion, when reforming the solitary confinement policy, there should also be a reform on healthcare programs. If the healthcare system is reformed, there will be less of a need to put individuals with mental illness in solitary confinement. To reform solitary confinement policy, there should be a main focus to create a team that consists of correctional, mental, and medical health staff. The team has the authority to decide how long an inmate can stay in solitary confinement and the ability to decide if the inmate is allowed back into general population or be transferred to a different ward for further evaluation. Currently, there are no alternatives to solitary confinement. It is particularly important that policy with regards to solitary confinement be changed in the near future to ensure the well-being of confined inmates who are mentally ill prior to incarceration. After reforming the policy, future evaluations must be conducted to determine whether the reformed policy can be safely used in prison, or if it should be limited even further or completely be eliminated. The reason we should reform the solitary confinement policy is because of the negative effects solitary confinement can cause to a person. In the video about the Pelican Bay inmates does support the research that being placed in solitary confinement does negatively affect how your brain functions. They had most of the symptoms such as stress, anxiety, and much more. It is best that we reform the policy as soon as possible before more inmates could be affected as well.